Quarterback controversy in Denver heading into training camp in 2022. Not so fast, Broncos country. The only question that we have is who will back up Broncos quarterback Russell Wilson. We talk about the two players behind Russ heading into training camp and whether or not the Broncos should keep everybody on the roster there at that position. You get that much more in today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Happy Friday. Welcome back into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, senior Broncos analyst at Mile High Sports, joined alongside by my co-host, as always, Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Folks, thank you once again for making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day for your daily objective Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage. You can get us free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format, or you can watch us on YouTube. If you have yet to hit that subscribe or that follow button, do so right now so you stay up to date on all things happening with the Denver Broncos. Sayre, my friend, our training camp position previews continue here today, and we finally have gotten to the quarterback position. And as we opened up with the show, no quarterback controversy entering Denver here this upcoming season. A lot of Broncos fans' concerns about having a premier player at the position have been alleviated. So we look at this position, we talk about the player and Russell Wilson, what he's going to bring to the table for Denver, but we also have to take a look at the guys behind him who will back him up this season in the orange and blue. Can't wait to break it down with you, my man.
I'm excited that that's the topic of discussion this year, Cody, as compared to last year. I think it was about a year ago that, I jumped on board with you, and we're getting close to that point anyway. And I just remember, at the time, obviously, it was Drew Lock and Teddy Bridgewater, and that was the whole conversation going into training camp, that everything revolved around that. And isn't it just nice to, not have that issue anymore, to not have to think who's going to be starting for this team, to not have that pressure of just, your whole roster depends on who, really starts at this position. Whether or not you have a good roster, as we've seen with the Denver Broncos, as their roster has continually gotten better and better over the last 3 or 4 years, who you have at quarterback matters more than anything. And now the Denver Broncos have Russell Wilson in the fold. It's such a refreshing change of pace, not just in terms of, the way we get to talk about the team, the way we get to talk about the roster, but just the way that you can project everything else based on the fact that he's now on the roster. This trade really changed everything for the Broncos.
Well, I think it's safe to say, if you're a betting man, this is the best quarterback the Broncos have had at pretty much any training camp since Peyton Manning put on the jersey. Nothing against Case Keenum, who lit up the Denver Broncos when he first came to training camp for the Broncos. And unfortunately, last year, as you mentioned it, we had just the ridiculous inconsistencies in reporting of who won the day. Was it Teddy Bridgewater? Was it Drew Lock? And just the whole dynamic that we saw there. This is a breath of fresh air because we're going to go to practice here in just a couple of weeks. We're going to watch Russell Wilson take command of the first team offense, but then we're going to see the two guys behind him really compete. But let's focus here, really just talking about what Russ does for this Denver Broncos team. He posted a video, I think, early on this week, and it just showed him preparing. Like, he's not in the country right now. I believe he's overseas, if I'm not mistaken. If not, he's either at his compound in San Diego or he's in Monaco, whatever it may be. But, man, the amount of work that this guy puts in and just how good he looks throwing the football on the run, his mechanics are very sharp. This will help the Broncos immensely, I think, more so than anybody they ever had. I was watching the Week 18 game that the Broncos had against the Kansas City Chiefs, and I was just looking at, nothing against Drew Lock. I love Drew, wish him nothing but the best in his career in Seattle, and I hope he finds a lot of success. But from a mechanical standpoint and an operations standpoint, you could just tell that he just didn't have it with this Broncos offense. You look at Russ in minicamp, you look at him in some of these practices, he's got total control. He's got total command. And as we've talked about here on the show, he's got total autonomy. Not only that, Sayre, but he also boosts, I think, the perception of the Broncos and the national media's attention. What does it do for them with Russ being under center?
Well, I think it really makes you a legitimate Super Bowl contender, right? And that's the expectation for the Denver Broncos pretty much every year, right? And that's why you see so many fans get up in arms over the quarterback situation, is because every fan in Broncos country has the expectation that you're always going to be competitive, that you're always going to be able to be in the playoffs and always be in contention. And that may seem like an unfair expectation, but I think that if you don't set your standards that high, what are you shooting at? And teams do go through rebuilding phases, teams go through reloading phases, teams have situations where, man, you may have to cycle through a few quarterbacks before you find the right one. But the Denver Broncos always have high aspirations. They always have championship expectations from the fan base and the ownership and just everybody within the organization. That's just the level of expectation for the Broncos. And of course, every organization would love to be able to say that, but the Broncos have actually proven it, right? They've gone out there and they've kind of willed their way to winning championships. And that's just the way that they've gone about business over and through the years. They've done whatever it takes to, as we know, be number one in everything. So I think for the Broncos right now with Russell Wilson at the QB position, you hit the nail on the head. It changes the national narrative, which that may matter more to some people than others. But I think just being able to have other people look at this team and finally say, hey, the Broncos are actually one of those teams in the mix in the AFC. I mean, that feels good to be able to go into another season talking about that. Remember in 2012, when Peyton Manning came on board through free agency, I still remember very clearly, Cody, the national narrative was relatively uncertain about the Broncos because Peyton Manning was coming off of 5 neck procedures and people didn't know, was he going to be the same Peyton Manning that they had seen 2 years before that? Were the Denver Broncos, was everything going to work out? They had these young, unproven for the most part, wide receivers at the time and unproven skill players and just all these different question marks that played into, that national narrative. Well, with Russell Wilson, as we're seeing, he raises all boats. He's that guy. He's that dude at the QB position. He's the game changer. He's the guy that now changes the expectation level from everyone within Broncos country, players on the roster, the coaching staff, the ownership, whatever, whoever you want to talk about, and now the national media, which is very, very good to see.
Well, I mean, I think it's very evident with the amount of nationally televised games the Broncos have. They've filled their 5 total slots that they're allotted. Plus, they'll appear on Christmas Day on CBS against the LA Rams. They'll appear on ESPN Plus against the Jacksonville Jaguars in London. There's 7 nationally televised games that are going to be available to a national audience, not to mention when Denver plays in the early morning slot or the afternoon slot. I mean, I would imagine, based on what other games are being played, that's probably going to be a favorite where whoever Russell Wilson and the Broncos are playing to be that America's kind of game of the week in the afternoon. And we'll see some Tony Romo on the broadcast this year for the Broncos. Looking forward to maybe seeing how that goes here as well. But Russell Wilson has reset the standard and the expectations to probably bigger than mile high expectations for this Broncos team here in 2022. But the bigger question remains at this position going into training camp: who backs up Russell Wilson? Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we take a look at Rypien and Josh Johnson, weigh the pros and cons about each of these players, and maybe determine who will back up Russ. You get to that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about Built Bar, the sponsor of today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. And folks, if you have not yet tried the new flavor, the coconut brownie chunk puff, you need to do so here today, because if you've already tried the coconut brownie chunk Built Bar just about several months ago when it was released by Built Bar, it was a fan favorite by those who consume it. Now they've turned it into the puff format, which contains marshmallow fluff and coconut brownie chunk flavor. 100% milk chocolate, plus the bars are easy to chew. And you know what? They're also healthy for you. 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. It's a great little boost to give you a little bit of energy throughout your day. And you can get yours today by going to built.com. And when you go to checkout, make sure you use promo code LOCK15, and that's going to get you 15% off your next order at built.com. When it pertains to the Broncos' backup quarterback job behind Russell Wilson this upcoming season in training camp, Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we're going to be heavily focused on Josh Johnson and Brett Rypien. Broncos country, thank you so much for making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much. Break it down really the tail of the tape here, Sayre. I think realistically speaking, this is a brand new coaching staff, a brand new philosophy under Nathaniel Hackett, but there is one carryover from the previous regime dating back to 2019, and that is Brett Rypien. Like, Brett Rypien has been a guy that has survived, the roster cuts. He's survived a lot of very up and down, I'd say, regimes from Vic Fangio in the last couple of years, and even just coordinators, Skangs, and being able to look at also other guys like Pat Shurmur. Brett Rippon has really kind of been a kind of a carryover from that. And it's because of his football knowledge, it's because of his expertise. And there's one thing I always remember about Brett Rippon, too, is throughout last year and the last couple of years as a Denver Bronco, he was the main guy when a quarterback was coming off the field. He had the iPad in his hand and he's coming up and he's talking to the starting quarterback. Hey, they're doing this. They rolled to this coverage on this play. Maybe, hey, let's look at hitting this on the other thing. And it just goes to show like this guy has this natural coaching ability to him, but it's valuable right now because he's still a player, right? So it gives me confidence there if something were to happen. And hopefully this is not the case with this Broncos team. But if something were to happen to a guy like Russell Wilson, I mean, I'd be okay with Brett Rippon being able to step up under center. Look, he's not going to play to the same magnitude, the same elite status, in my opinion, as a Russell Wilson, but I think he can run the offense the way that Nathaniel Hackett wants to be run. I mean, what are your reservations here on Brett Rippon? And then we'll focus on Josh Johnson, who was brought over via NFL free agency.
Yeah, I think really the only reservations with Brett Rippon are really the physical limitations, like you mentioned, by comparison to a guy like Russell Wilson, especially. You're not looking at the biggest, the fastest, the strongest arm. It's not that with Brett Rippon, but he wins up above here, right? And we saw that when he was a younger player, able to come in and actually play for the Denver Broncos, actually do some things. I know he threw an interception against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but man, it felt like when he got into the game in that Buccaneers game a couple years ago, didn't it feel like really the offense actually started moving and Brett
They
Rippon
did.
was the guy, engineering it. So then he did the same against the New York Jets, had obviously some down moments, but also some very, very nice moments as well. So certainly his game has always been about rhythm and timing and quantity and quality with that quantity, just being able to put the ball in the right spot and in college at least limit those mistakes. So I think for him, it's definitely like having a coach in the huddle or a coach on the sideline, somebody who sees things very well. He may not be that game changer at the QB position, but he's certainly an important voice for your quarterback room as a whole. And I think that there's definitely more to be said about that than not. When you're talking about today's NFL, it's not just about compiling the best group of 3 quarterbacks or 2 quarterbacks or however many you keep, although you do want to have good players in that room, but you also want to have really smart players that can see things that you're maybe not seeing, or like you said, pointing things out as you come off the sideline, say, hey, we should try this next time, or we should do this next time, or here's what they were rolling to, or whatever the case may be. So I think that's where Brett Rippon really becomes valuable to the Denver Broncos and why he's stuck on the roster now. He was an undrafted free agent in 2019. So this is his 4th year with the team now. And that speaks volumes considering the amount of changes this team has had and different front office completely. It speaks volumes to what Brett Rippon has been able to prove as just a football mind out there.
Well, don't be surprised too when his playing career is all said and done, whatever that may be. There's a strong belief that maybe he'll get into coaching, and he probably has a really bright future. His uncle Mark was obviously a Super Bowl MVP, Mark Rippon. So yeah, it's in the blood there. It's in the Rippon DNA to coach, and obviously just having this mindset there. I'm super excited about Brett Rippon. One thing I'm really looking forward to seeing is he and Josh Johnson in preseason. Not only are these guys going to be competing against each other in training camp, rotating with the second string and also the third string offense here. But we're going to see them against other competition, and I'm excited and I'm rooting for both of them to succeed. So that now takes us to Josh Johnson, who's really kind of been in the NFL. I mean, he first came to the NFL, Sayre, when I was a sophomore in high school. That was in 2009. I mean, this is a guy that's been around for quite some time. There's been stints where he's disappeared. It's been off for like 1 to 2, maybe 1 to 3 years from an NFL team before finding a way to get onto a roster. And we saw that last year with the New York Jets. We saw it with the Baltimore Ravens, where he actually came in and he actually played pretty well. Like, he was very efficient. Unfortunately, like, they didn't win games with him, but he wasn't a reason that they lost football games, the Jets or the Ravens, when they had him. So I think that's something to kind of hang your hat on. He's got the athletic traits to kind of, I think, replicate a little bit as to like maybe what Russ can do with the mobility presence of his game here. But I mean, he even mentioned in an interview on the national media that Nathaniel Hackett, the way he's tailoring this offense for Russell Wilson, he's also tailoring it for Brett Rippon in his own way, for Josh Johnson in his own way. So it's like, what will we see from this offense? What will we see from a guy like Josh Johnson?
Well, I'm excited to see him play. You talk about how old you were when he came into the league. I was just looking through some old football cards back at my hometown when I visited there. I was looking through all these different old sets that I had, and I came upon a few Josh Johnson rookie cards, which is kind of crazy to think about. I mean, he came out of San Diego, and he was kind of an intriguing prospect at the time. He played for Jim Harbaugh back in the day at San Diego before he got his gig at Stanford. So kind of an interesting background. He's worked with so many different big name coaches throughout his football career, and definitely, very closely crossed paths. I thought for sure he would have crossed paths with Nathaniel Hackett in Tampa Bay and Buffalo at his different stops there, but they were just 1 year apart. But he worked with a ton of Titans in the coaching industry back when he was drafted. Obviously, John Gruden and the Buccaneers, and it just has blossomed throughout. Obviously, Jim Harbaugh at his college years. So he has a wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge, tons of time on task, whether that's on the practice field, getting spot starting duty, coming in an emergency situation. He has experienced pretty much every level of it. He started at different levels of professional football, playing in those different leagues that have kind of now come and gone, but he's played all over the place. And I think there's certainly value in having Josh Johnson on your roster, in your quarterback room, just like Brett Rypien, but he's been around for a lot longer. He's been around for over a decade now doing this. So that makes things very interesting to me. Again, is it like having a coach in your quarterback room with Josh Johnson, being able to see things and pick things out on the game film and really just be a valuable voice in that way? I really like the addition that the Broncos made, bringing him in. I know it may not be the highest profile pickup, but certainly I think he has a good shot at being that clear number two behind Russell going into the season.
It's certainly something to keep an eye on as we get ready for Broncos camp on July 26th. The rookies and the veterans will report. They'll all spend time together at the team hotel, and it's something that players are very excited about. And the way that Nathaniel Hackett has made this transition here, players are super excited. It's a lot different right now from how the players are feeling about reporting to the team hotel for training camp than it was last year, Sayre. I can tell you that personally. So that is something exciting to follow, and we'll be watching this quarterback competition along the way, but it has nothing to do with Russell Wilson. But Broncos country, how many quarterbacks will the Broncos keep on the active roster in 2022? That's something Sayre and I, we ponder and we debate whether or not the Broncos should keep two or whether they should keep all three of the guys that are currently on roster as is. You get to that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about betonline.net, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports information. You can find all the latest sports developments, league news, and reviews, including MLB, including UFC, MMA, and golf, plus NFL futures, all in one place at betonline.net. They remain the best spot for all your sports scores and news this upcoming season. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action at betonline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, real quick, Broncos country, thank you so much once again for taking time out of your day to listen or to watch Sayre, Bedinger, and I talk all things Denver Broncos here on the Locked On Broncos podcast, because we have you covered every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. Thank you so much for listening on your favorite podcast provider, or whether you're watching us on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, please do us a favor, comment on the video, hit the like button, share it for the algorithm. We appreciate you so much, and we love interacting with everybody in Broncos country. Sayre, continuing on with our projecting maybe how the roster may shake out. And realistically speaking, we've talked about receiver, safety, cornerback. We've talked about inside off-ball linebackers. And as you start to make some of these decisions, I'm starting to look at the list that I've created. I'm like, man, the Broncos are going to have some very, very interesting decisions to make, because you only are allowed 53 spots on the active roster. And there's going to be a lot of change between from the 90-man roster, once we get the training camp, to the last preseason game where it goes from 80 to 53. There's going to be a lot of change and a lot of guys moving on. So it's like, how do you project how things are going to go? I feel like it could be easier here at the quarterback position, Sayre, because we look at this Broncos team. I think you look at the outlook. Russell Wilson, the premier star of this franchise, will be the signal play caller here for the Broncos this upcoming season. But in the event something were to happen to him, you have these two guys that are going to be competing at training camp, and Brett Rypien and Josh Johnson. Are you better served, if you were the Denver Broncos, to hold three quarterbacks on your active roster, or whoever wins the competition between Josh Johnson and Brett Rypien? Because I find myself thinking all the time, because unfortunately the Broncos have been in this situation. I don't think you ever want to move Kendall Hinton back to quarterback. Like, he could do it for you. You just don't want to do that. That's not who he is here at the NFL level. And he's obviously had a bigger role and he's proven himself at wide receiver. I feel like personally, Sayre, Denver needs to keep all three of these guys. You lose if you release or you waive Brett Rypien. I think another NFL team will claim him. He's been one of those guys that have been clamored after by a lot of NFL teams. I think in this situation, you have to have three quarterbacks on the active roster just in case something were to happen, because Josh Johnson was a byproduct of going to teams that went through multiple quarterbacks due to injuries. Hopefully that's not the case in Denver.
Yeah, you really don't want to have to get into a situation like you were in a couple years ago. That's for certain. Yeah, although Kendall Hinton, Mr. Hall of Famer himself, showed a lot of courage by doing that and going out there. But obviously, I think that to play devil's advocate here, Brett Rypien, unless he has an otherworldly preseason, you could see, and the Broncos have snuck him onto the practice squad in the past a couple times, even as recently as last year. So it's one of those things where, we've been talking about this. 11 defensive backs, 7 wide receivers. We'll see what happens when we start talking about O-line and edge rushers and all these different things. If you're crunching the numbers on this roster, you could see an avenue that you have to take and say, hey, Brett, we're going to send you to waivers and see what happens here, hoping for the best. But that would be really tough, wouldn't it? Just because of the things that we just mentioned, the reasons we just mentioned. You've obviously had some issues at this position in the past with guys. If you get a guy that gets injured, you don't want to be sitting there with your pants down and being like, well, I guess, just to save a roster spot for this particular guy that we want to develop at wide receiver or safety or whatever, we sacrificed Brett Rypien for that roster spot. Then all of a sudden you're caught between a rock and a hard place and looking dumb for doing what you did. So it's going to be one of those very, very fascinating situations to watch unfold, just to see how does Brett Rypien play in the preseason. I think that's going to dictate whether or not you're able to get him through waivers, unless there's some team out there that just really highly values the things that we just talked about. A coach out there that knows, hey, this guy can really be an asset to our quarterback room and we've got a spot for him here. Maybe you take that risk, maybe you don't. But I think in terms of the rest of the roster, that's what's going to determine whether or not the Broncos keep 2 or 3 guys. And I know I'm just talking about Brett Rypien, but like you mentioned, Cody, there's a chance that Rypien could be the guy that actually goes out there and wins that number 2 job. In which case, would you try to sneak Josh Johnson onto the practice squad with those veteran allowances? Would that actually end up happening? I mean, those are very, very interesting things to look at. That's all going to be determined, in my opinion, by what these guys put on tape in the preseason, what they can show, in those game opportunities, because I don't think we're going to see a ton of Russell Wilson in the preseason. But, these backup guys, they do have an opportunity not only to put themselves out there as the number 2 in Denver, but maybe a number 2 or a number 3 in another NFL city.
Well, as of the time we're recording this, it popped in my head. We're legitimately 1 month away from there being the first preseason game that the Broncos have against the Dallas Cowboys. So, hey, 1 month until we actually see football on the field against another team. I'm excited. We're going to have complete coverage and breakdown here in the Lockdown Broncos podcast. You make some great points about that. But there's even a scenario, too, that's crossed my mind that could be a possibility, right? Because when NFL teams have to make their roster cuts, there could be some certain quarterbacks out there. Let's say if the Broncos do pass on somebody, or if Brett Rypien or Josh Johnson simply aren't going to be the backup to Russ, or you're going to get rid of one of those guys, but you need to have another insurance policy at quarterback. If Rypien can't make it onto the practice squad, if he loses the competition, Denver could pick up another quarterback off of waivers from what teams release. That's something I didn't keep in the back of my mind until right now. So I do like that as a possibility. For me personally, I look at Brett Rypien, I look at Josh Johnson, and I feel like if something were to happen, I feel like both these guys could come in and run the offense optimally. Like we said, it's not going to be to the same exact standard that we would see with Russell Wilson or that we would expect from Russell Wilson, but they could do the things that Nathaniel Hackett would need them to do in order to make the offense kind of click a little bit. The short passing game, the intermediate game, the mobility if Josh Johnson's that guy, a strong running game with Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon. And that, to me, I feel like are some things that the Broncos could dial back on if, in fact, there were an injury to the Broncos star premier player in Russell Wilson, which obviously, knock on wood, we hope nothing happens at all all, we hope the Broncos have a relatively healthy season here in 2022. Broncos country, that'll wrap up today's episode of Locked On Broncos as we've previewed the quarterback position heading into training camp. When we return for Monday's episode, Locked On Broncos, we're going to take a look at the running back position for this football team. We're going to take a look at who could compete for that number 3 running back spot. What will the workload be like between Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon? You'll get that and much more on Monday's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Have a great weekend.